Welcome back to the Orthodox Ethos. Tonight, we have a special guest to talk to us about the Orthodox principles of education, and that is Dr. Mark Tarpley. What an honor to have an old friend and a very important contributor to this discussion in Orthodox America. Right back with you in just a moment. Mark, welcome to Orthodox Ethos. It's a joy to have you with us.
Thank you, Father Peter. It's a joy to be here.
So we're before we get into our topic tonight, Orthodox Principles of Education, let me introduce you to some of our viewers who may not know of your work. Mark has a M.Div from St. Tikhon's Theological Seminary. He worked under the guidance of Dr. Christopher Veniamin on his M.D. thesis and his doctoral dissertation, which he received from the Southern Methodist University. He also did his graduate work focused on the Church Fathers, writings on marriage, family, and education. He is presently the administrator in the role of academic dean at the Christian Life Preparatory School in Fort Worth, Texas. He has over 25 years in the field of education, and he's going to tell us, I hope, a little bit about how he approaches his present work in this field, his philosophy and his approach to education with all of his experience. He has 7 children, and some of them have graduated college, from what I understand. And so we have a lot to discuss. And why don't we begin our discussion? Well, first of all, why are we doing this tonight? One of the reasons we're doing this tonight is on the occasion of the publication of a new book from Uncle Mountain Press. That's the occasion for our discussion, although it's not really going to be the focus of our discussion. But this text right here, which is now in circulation, you can see it on the screen, Formation in the Love of Truth, Principles of Orthodox Education, which I've put together basically from a variety of lectures and question and answer sessions over the years, some of them which I gave, I think, at the same conference that that I met you at. Is that not? Maybe I'm mistaken about that, but that's what I think. Back in 2017 or 18.
One of those years. Yep, we were together.
Yeah, we were at the St. Cosmas Education, Homeschooling and Education Conference in California, and so we've published that. And I thought, instead of just publishing the book and letting it circulate, let's take the occasion to talk with others who are in the field of Orthodox education and have experience, and maybe we can start to discuss this. As one of the things we discussed on the phone yesterday was that there's not a lot of discussion going on. And so why do you think that is? Let's start there. Why do you think that there isn't a robust, or maybe I'm wrong, maybe that's not the case, but it seems to me there's not a robust problematic and concern and development online with podcasts and things like that to kind of go deeper and create a uniquely Orthodox approach to both homeschooling and the Orthodox Academy.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an important question to address, and I think I would start by framing it within the broader question of just the attention given to our children and youth in the church at large in America. And so this is kind of a sub conversation of that larger conversation that I think as a whole we don't give enough attention to, related to the formation and growth and development of our youth and our children in this country. And so I think by extension, it's natural that if that conversation isn't front and center, I think then the question of maybe even just what we might call formal education also begins to dissipate in terms of its focus and energy and time. I think the other part of it seems to be the case that a lot of people are quite comfortable with let's say the formal education on offer, although we do definitely have a growing, let's say, grassroots swell, I think, of engagement by parents themselves, as particularly homeschooling families, on this question of education and the formation of their children and let's say, quote, how they're going to engage, let's say, the formal structures of the education of their children. So I do think it's happening at the grassroots, but there's not a lot of, nearly as much conversation at the leadership levels And I don't mean just necessarily ecclesial. I just mean in general among educators. We have a lot of educators that are Orthodox in this country that actually, in universities and in schools, but it doesn't seem to generate as much direct conversation into the specific Orthodox space as a whole. Yeah.
So one of the things I addressed in the book, which seems to me to be very important, at least it was for us, is that we came to slowly, as we became more interested in raising our own children, when we began this process 25 years ago, we said, well, how are we going to raise our children? And you're faced with an important, immediate question for your own household. And so we went deeper and deeper into these questions for ourselves. And we encountered the history of compulsory education. And that's one of the first, that's the first lecture that we have in the book. We're looking at compulsory education and seeing that, in fact, that vision, that reality, which many people take for granted, it really is not very conducive to orthodoxy. It's got its own agenda. It's a part of modernity more than it is really the ancient world. Now, some of it's good. I mean, we want to educate our children, obviously, and there's a systematic approach, but compulsory state education has a totally different agenda than we might think. And when we began to realize that, and we began to see the need and the benefit of homeschooling, then we jumped on and we became personally very excited and did a lot of work in that direction in Greece at the time. Is it because our Orthodox people in America have not come to that realization? They don't see the dangers? I mean, is it possible that we still don't see the dangers of contemporary public compulsory education and the whole the bad socialization that's going on? Is that it, or is it that we just don't have the wherewithal and the determination to make our own way? What do you think? Or is it a little bit of both? Or
yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of complexities in the question. You have let's say Orthodox that have come to the country as immigrants, right, and may not be as sensitive to the cultural realities that are going on, or thinking, well, we'll put our kids in these schools, and in a certain way, you're putting a lot of trust in those systems. And then I think in America, for the converts, I mean, a lot of people were raised in those systems, and it's really all they know. And so I think those are at least two I think dominant angles on why there's not more criticism. But I think in general, I think to the point and to the points in your book, the story isn't actually told of how the education system we have in America came to be. And I think when people can begin to understand the actual story behind it, I mean, it's a revolutionary system. And I think it kind of goes back to just, what is the purpose of education, right? Well, the purpose of education, at a micro level, at a small level is to form the child, right? But at the macro scale levels, it's to pass on the culture from one generation to the next. And so in this sense, I think education is arguably maybe the most important lens by which to see into the heart of a culture. In other words, what do you educate your children on? And then what does that say about what the culture holds as its highest values? And so I think right now, interestingly enough, we are going through a bit of a kind of a cultural educational revolution, but it's not towards Christianity, right? It's toward a more postmodern structure of education that's challenging actually what you're talking about, which is the modern structures of education. And so, I think a question you can ask, to find out pretty easily, what is the education system about forming? You can always ask someone, what do you want to be when you grow up? You could ask a student that. And almost invariably in our culture, they're going to answer with a job. Right. And I think that, I'm going to be this, I'm going to be that, right? They don't answer with, what would be my hope, at least for Christians, would be, if you asked a child, what do you want to be when you grow up? They would say, I want to be a faithful Christian. I want to be a faithful disciple of Jesus Christ. I want to be, a faithful spouse, a faithful parent, a faithful citizen. They go directly to the job, and that tells you that must be the very heart of our education system, is a fundamental structure towards utilitarianism, towards a work for profit, et cetera. And if you look at, I think, our public compulsory systems from that angle, I think the schools are quite good in doing what they say they're going to do. right? They're going to produce people who see their vocation, their life purpose as working for profit. And they're willing to do that as long as they need to do it. And in a certain sense, there's a perceived nobility because it's for the greater good of the society, right? That we equate oftentimes, although people believe it less now because we're in, economically we're not as strong as maybe we were in the past. But certainly when you're looking at the early 1900s, the reformers like a Woodrow Wilson and a John Dewey, a Cubberley, what they're looking at, right, is a pragmatist structure, a secular, purely secular structure that has a deep faith in the capacity for a society to grow and mature through material transformation towards utopian structures. And they're not hiding it, and they're not hiding their dislike for Christianity. It's very open in their writings, and it's easily accessible. So I think to your point, that can be a jarring narrative or story to people when they first hear it, but you can go back yourself pretty easily and read the documents and the aims and goals. And I think most apparently is if you look at the mission of schools, right? If you look at almost any urban city public school, their mission is explicitly stated, which is to prepare all students for college and workforce readiness. That's their purpose. And so you would expect, if they're a good school district, that they've aligned everything they do towards that end and only that end. Where, if you're a Christian school, Orthodox Christian school, your mission would have to be to form faithful Orthodox Christians. Yes. And then, of course, the question becomes, what does that actually look like? And it certainly couldn't look like the same aim as becoming a for-profit worker. And so, I think it's a space as we mature in America. It's one that we've got to take seriously, because I think everyone universally, not essentially universally, but I think everyone in America generally recognizes as Orthodox, if education is passing on the soul of the life of a culture from one generation to the next, we as Orthodox want to pass on the soul of our faith to the next generation. And the question actually becomes, how do we do this well? And that's the question I think we have to be attentive to, because while we want to draw people into the faith, certainly through manifesting divine love to those around us, we don't want to give up our children. We want, maybe another way to look at that, Father, is to ask the question, what does it mean to exceed your parents, right? So in the modern structures of thought, to exceed my parents would be for me to be more materially wealthy than my parents, to have a bigger home than them, right? But I think in the patristic tradition, to exceed your parents is to exceed them in virtue.
Yes.
Right. We see this in the lives of the saints, how, in the Cappadocians, right, the first generation, the second generation, this building of holiness, of sanctity. And that's true success for the Orthodox. When St. Gregory, the theologian, praises in his oration on his friend St. Basil the Great, he, not unsurprisingly, begins immediately by praising St. Basil's parents. Right. That the fruit of their holiness and purity and faithfulness is their children, who in turn exceed them. And this would be the great praise of a parent, that their children have exceeded them in virtue not being Aristotelian good habits, but right in a theanthropic divine human union with the living God and Jesus Christ.
That presupposes that our parents know what it means to be virtuous and saintly. And yes, that means that we've been well formed as Orthodox Christians, and we have a very good, robust catechetical formation process, or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah. When I was doing my master's, I did, it was a limited, let's say, study, but it did attempt to take everything at that time that was available in English and look at every century of what every saint, church father wrote about raising children, right? And across every century, you had some variations, maybe on discipline a little bit, or how to discipline a child's behavior or whatever, these different areas. But the three that never changed from century to century were, number one, do the parents pray for their children? Number two, do the parents participate in the liturgical and sacramental life of the church with their children? And then number three, do they set the good example in their bond of love for one another? And that bond of love with one another assumes an ascetical life. And I think we could say that's a catechesis, right? Catechesis involves certainly a knowledge of the church in our understanding, right? Our self-understanding of, maybe what is an icon, or, what is happening in the liturgy. And that's a good and necessary thing. But catechesis, at the deeper levels, if you're looking at, St. Cyril of Jerusalem or some of the church fathers, it involves the ascetical life of purification. And as St. Justin Popovich says, the consummate educator, ultimately is the saint, the one who imparts the grace of God. And so I think, as parents, we have this, I'd say, an awesome experience. I think liturgically, it's pretty universal in America that, when the mother and child are churched, that the child is given to the priest turns and offers the child to God. And then, and effectively the parents are giving the child to God, right? And then the priest turns and lays the child down, or hands the child back, depending on the tradition, and then entrusts the child to those parents, as to care and be the primary caretakers and raisers within the life of the church, within the local community. And there we see the first steps of, let's say, catechesis of the child. I
want to make sure we don't miss this, but so we're going to come back to this, but so I want to say one other thing that before I forget as well, but we would definitely want to discuss what you think the roles and the limits or boundaries are in this process that you're just discussing in terms of formation between the parent and then the school.
Yep.
If you're an Orthodox school, let's say you have an Orthodox school locally, or you have an Orthodox teacher online or something like that that's involved in the formation of the child. I'd like to talk about the roles in your mind. But before we do that, I want to just circle back to John Dewey for a minute, because we're fighting a little bit internally among the Orthodox to get a proper understanding of where we live, what the society is doing, the roots to it. I think a lot of what you discussed is most Orthodox have no clue about the roots of public and education in America, John Dewey and others. And the little I remember when I was doing some research was, along with the secular goals that you talked about, there was this very great need, and they were charged with it, to assimilate the immigrants into basically a lowest common denominator, cultural, linguistic uniformity, so that the United States could function as a country. I remember, my grandfather and all the immigrants in the 20s, 10s, going back to the late 19th century, there was a great pressure to basically forget your past, forget your identity, learn English, and become an American. And I think a lot of that was being communicated from the culture, state, and through the education. So a big part of American education had to be with, well, how do we get this, these vastly different experiences of culture and identity and history to basically come together in one identity, the American identity. So there was that melting pot that people talk about. And if that was a big, part of the agenda for education to function along with the state and to create that homogeneity, that means that one of the goals was for us to cease to be peculiarly and uniquely different than our Protestant, Roman Catholic, and others, things that would divide us, and the Orthodox way, the Orthodox understanding, all the rest. Am I saying it correctly, or am I not representing part of the agenda?
Yeah, I mean, there's several things going on there. I mean, within that movement, they're progressives, and what I mean by progressive isn't a political progressive, a philosophical progressive, which is a belief that the world moves ever towards a greater perfection in a kind of deterministic way, and
utopianists.
A utopianist, right?
Yeah,
it moves from chaos to order, and within that structure, that change is the norm, right? So one of the things John Dewey notes is that he says the philosophical underpinnings of Darwinianism, will revolutionize and undermine what he calls the intellectual furniture of the mind that's been in place for 2,000 years in Western society. Well, there, of course, he's explicitly talking about Christianity. Right. He says this philosophical revolution, which is basically for him a disregard for the unchanging world does not exist, and that the only thing that exists is the changing world. And this world is in a state of constant change, and that changes toward greater progress. So that by necessity, I think, requires you to disregard your past altogether, right? Because it's, we have this out with the old, in with the new. It's kind of it's a very kind of standard kind of trope in America, that the next iPhone is better than the previous one, right? Anything new is better than something old. And so by definition, without even having to worry about Orthodox Catholics and Protestants, it's dismissive of any Christianity, which would include Orthodoxy as well, right? That it's a dismissal of the past as a whole, and Dewey is very explicit about that. I think the other part about what you're talking about is with Woodrow Wilson. He has a famous speech to the New York City teachers where he talks about the fact that we're at a crisis in America because effectively, the 19th century had a good bit of, let's say, traditional liberal arts or education in it. But with the industrialization, they weren't producing the workers that could do the monotonous task work. And so basically his point was, we're at a crisis because we're losing in the global economy, and we need to rebuild the education system to produce the workers we need. And so, Woodrow Wilson and others, they call for a two-tier system. One, he says, is for the masses, and one is for the elites. And the masses are technical skilled workers, which interestingly enough for him includes scientists and engineers. They're just highly qualified, skilled laborers. And then incidentally, the elite class should receive a liberal arts education because that's where the mind is formed. So they should read poetry and history and literature so that they can properly manage the masses. And then this will set us up so that we can stop seeing made in Germany and start seeing made in the USA.
So I think it's a new world version of the caste system. It's like a new world version of the caste system.
Well, and certainly, if you look at that history, there seems to be influence from Indian caste system into the New York area, along with the Prussian, some mixing in there to be able to create, a compliant, dedicated workforce that believes in this progress that sets ahead.
That's really from the get-go with compulsory education in 1800, right? In the Germanic lands where that all began. That's exactly what they were saying from the beginning. I think is we need this education system, and they did a two-tier thing just like you did. They weren't interested in formation of anything but except the skills necessary to do the new, work that would be going on in the new industrial revolution. So America was basically following in the footsteps of that was already going on for 100 years, right?
Yeah, it's coming from, oftentimes, like everything, a lot of things come from Europe. And I would say, just to reemphasize, really the heart of it is a philosophical revolution of the modern world. It's not so. I don't perceive, for example, that someone's saying, let's build a totalitarian education system, right? In those ways. I think what they're saying is we see the world this way, philosophically, and so we need to conform all dimensions of that world to this, including education. And so education in some ways is one of the later things to change fully, right? Because you are touching children. You are, but of course, as I think if anyone who looks at history, if you really want to control a culture, you control the education systems. And so you see that happening.
So forgive me for interrupting, but just to get to the more practical point for our listeners, why would Orthodox, if we knew all this, which we apparently don't, most of us, why would we ever look to public education in the West for anything really inspirational? For our children and what we need to do for our children. Is there a lot there to save? What should we take if there's that's worth taking?
Well, I think at the philosophical level, there isn't much there to inspire us, right? At the I say not pragmatic but practical level of where you live. For example, if you live in a rural area in a small community, certainly the shape and look of the schools is quite different from an urban school, right? And depending on so I'm looking at the practical question of should you send your child to a public school? Well, I think it's a complicated question from just the practical side of things, right? What are the circumstances, et cetera, that you find yourself in? But if your children, and I've taught in public schools, if your children are in public schools, I think you have a strong responsibility to be very vigilant, making sure you're having regular, constant conversations with your children. You're very close to the church. Your children are actively engaging in the ascetical and sacramental life of the church appropriately, going to confession, etc. To be able to deal with the, I would say the hidden structures that deeply shape, because there's a lot of good people that, quite honestly work in public schools and seek to do good work, but the former structures of the school are very powerful.
Yes.
And they work on you from the outside, kind of invisibly in certain ways, through the curriculums, through the standardization structures, through the messaging that comes about your purposes in life, etc. Like I said, though, it's an interesting space from the observer perspective, not the participant, in the sense that a lot of that modern education structures are being deeply challenged. And again, it's not by the Christians, right? It's not by the Orthodox Christians. It's actually by the postmodern movements. And that's
Are they going for more? Are they going for more what? Decentralization or more?
They're just, I mean, to me, they're just deconstructivists, right? They're raising questions of the hidden structures of the schools and saying they pull and operate power, right? And I think as Orthodox, we can say that's got to be true, because if it's a secular structure, right, there's no higher power. So it's people exercising power over other people, not the divine God, and love. That's the hierarchy.
Right.
So there are, when you flatten everything, you're going to get some kind of humanistic power structure. Of course, the problem in the postmodern critique is, okay, well, once you deconstruct the power, who gets the power?
Right.
And so it's kind of a cannibalistic vision of life, which is why, as Father Seraphim Rose points out, it's nihilism. It's like kind of a naked nihilism that comes forth, where there's no meaning to anything at all, not even a conservative view of conserving the desire for material perfection. And so it dumps into a wasteland, ultimately, I guess you could say.
And that's where you think the public education is increasingly headed, or already there?
I mean, I think the trajectory of the underpinnings philosophically, if it's a secular structure that sees things through a material perspective, there is no higher reality at all, much less the faith. Then I think by it's been a slow churn for quite a while, centuries. But I think we're approaching towards the end of that line of thought, and that's why it's disintegrating before our eyes in a certain way, as we currently stand culturally.
So the response of the Orthodox increasingly has been either homeschooling, or now you see, I think in the last 10 years, I would say there's been a noticeable increase in attempts to start Orthodox academies, Orthodox schools. And do you think both of these are viable responses to this, the zeitgeist and this nihilistic spirit, or do you think there's one is better than the other? It just depends on the context and the parent. And let's begin there, and then we can talk more specifics about the roles of educators and parents.
Well, I mean, I think homeschooling itself is in its origins, even outside of Orthodoxy, right? It's a movement within American education. Even going back into the early 80s, it was illegal for in a lot of places I don't know, maybe it was everywhere, but I know in at least in some places it was illegal to do it. And it was, I don't mean this negatively, but it was a reaction to the forces of power and strength that were being taken over people's children to raise them as they saw fit. And so in a certain way, I would say that homeschooling, and I don't mean this in a negative way either, but it represents like a primitive a movement to the most primitive state, right? Which is that family within the local church trying to raise their children, right?
Yeah.
And so
And by the way, the homeschool movement, and you can correct me wrong, it was not only conservatives, although maybe predominantly, but there were very people on the left and people all over the place who just wanted control over their own children.
Right, and that's why I said originally the homeschooling movement was a recognition of the lack of autonomy of the parent, regardless of what you believe. People were just like, I'd actually like I'd like to raise my children as I see fit and according to the ways that I live and believe. Certainly, I'd say my gut is the majority were Christians in the movement as a whole. And I think, in that sense, it's certainly a viable path to raise your children. I do think, though, to reduce, education as the passing on of culture to just, let's say, a nuclear family wouldn't be ideal, right? I think
there's always the danger of reacting, going to and not having a Catholic in a true sense of holistic response. I mean, we saw this with the Reformation. They reacted against the papacy, but they didn't go back to the Catholicity, and so they ended up disintegrating. So there's a danger that if everyone, and I think I felt that in Greece. I mean, the Greek culture is very, well, comparatively to ours, very social, right? Not individualistic. And so when we were doing homeschooling in our mountain village in Greece, and I was in a village that still had a pretty good identity in spite of everything. Urbanization had destroyed so many villages. They reacted like really kind of negatively. Why are you doing that? Why are you taking your children out of school? That seems to be not an Orthodox way. We need to stay. First of all, the state and the church is, basically one, and we need to have the Orthodox principles that should be coming down to the school and to the children, communicated to the whole community. So there was a community, that reacted against that individualism that was represented by homeschooling. Now, that's a very different context. In America, individualism is the norm, and they're most likely, and I think in most cases Orthodox, they're reacting in that way not to go necessarily more individualistic, but actually to be more connected to the church and have a community. So it's a totally different, different context.
Yeah, and in the local parish setting, for example, if you have 2 homeschooling families out of 50 families, right, that's one dynamic for those homeschooling families. And if you have 46 homeschooling families and 4 that don't, that's a completely different dynamic. Right. But I'm just trying to, I think my primary point is that, Orthodoxy and Christ himself, right? I mean, there's, sin produces division, and then Christ brings unity. And so that unity, and it may be an ideal, but not losing sight of the ideal of the formation of a child within the family, within the local community, within the local parish community, would be in a certain way important to be able to, I think that's a direction as Orthodox we have to continue to work to strive, whether that's in co-ops. I don't think that, the end goal is an Orthodox formal school academy per se. That, it comes with its own set of challenges, which is, first of all, now you're dealing with money, which is a very complicated part of running a school. And then the second part is, you do have to have well-formed teachers. And that's something in America in general, I would say is lacking, because most of us grow up in the modern progressive compulsory structure. And then many of the teachers are trained to teach within a modern compulsory progressive pedagogy. And so what I mean by that is, if you had an Orthodox school, an Orthodox academy, you want to obviously do your best, because if the children are in that academy, that they're seeing that as orthodoxy, right? Just like when they said,
this is the difficulty. We're saying, here's the Orthodox way, here's the Orthodox education, but we ourselves oftentimes don't know if that's the case, or we're borrowing from the Protestants or the world. And so there's a lot of it's still under development in a lot of places.
I think so. But I think going back to our first point at the beginning, if raising our children is let's say the most sacred work, And again, even if you're looking at, go back to like St. John Chrysostom on virginity, his text there, right? Where do they, when they write on virginity, where do they begin? Well, they begin by praising the parents of the pure virgin, right? We praise St. Joachim and Anna. We praise the parents. They always praise marriage before they praise virginity in their treatises on virginity, because you can't have virginity without a righteous set of parents. And so this always becomes one of their major defenses of marriage as being intrinsically good, is because, when you see the great saint like St. Basil the Great or St. John Chrysostom or St. John of Damascus or whoever it is who is living a monastic life, they had parents. And so
and
I think
usually very virtuous, and usually very virtuous parents.
Well, virtuous. They had parents, and they were virtuous parents, which is what they're being praised for, right? They're not just praising that they had parents. I'm sorry, they're praising the virtue of the parents. And so I think this comes back to the catechesis, because if we can continue to nurture and grow and strengthen the catechesis of our families and our parents in the homes, then the fruits of that will be educators, right? Formal educators, perhaps, but educators in our children who are prepared to give witness to and speak to the faith and raise the next generation, and the church will flourish, and those fruits will come to fruition. So I think it does.
Yeah, I was going to say, this is really, I think, where a lot of people have a lot of questions. How do you understand the roles, the division of labor, the roles between parents, parish, and let's say we're in a community where there's a school, the Orthodox school or the Orthodox educator. Does the parish pretty much, is it responsible for the catechism? Is it the parents that really are like the bulk of the catechism? Does the school play a role in catechism, or should it just be, the secular worldly knowledge? And how do you see that? Because I think there's not a lot of clarity in practice today on the ground.
No, I mean, I think it's one of the most important questions that when you're dealing with Orthodox schools to sort through. I mean, we have examples of Orthodox schools that, let's say, are parochial in the sense that they're under the authority of the local parish, of course, is under the local bishop, right? We have Orthodox schools that are maybe in a certain way under the diocesan structure, but not directly under a parish. And I know that for sure we have Orthodox schools that are, let's say, operate with the blessing of a bishop, but they're independent entirely from the diocesan structure. And I've had various conversations with different people about this. I think it's there's a lot of layers, I guess, what I'd say to the conversation. I would say, for our time today, that I think it's important to understand that the family, in the marriage service, we see a new kingdom being established, right? A new king and queen of a home, which is a sacred kingdom. St. Gregory talks about the role of the wife to build this kingdom, right? And then the husband, of course, protects this kingdom, and that exists all within the kingdom of God, which is why St. John says, that the home is a little church. But it's not a little church because it's apart from, it's a little church because it's an expansion of the church. And it's let's say the home is a cell that has life within the church, the body. And so if the home is isolated or separated from the church, then it starves. So certainly the home operates within the church itself. I tend to see educational institutions as coming along, and the parents are entrusting that institution with a part of the responsibility that the parents have. They're not giving it up, but they're still governing and overseeing that experience, but that they are entrusting those teachers, those administrators, with their children to walk alongside them and perform that part of that sacred task that they've been given, which in itself isn't a giving up in the sense that it's broadening and deepening the community for the children, right? Of people that can hopefully positively shape them and guide them and nurture them. The question of, who does the catechism, certainly in a local parish, the priest governs the catechesis, whether he's doing it directly or he has people doing it for him. But
just to clarify the terms here, catechism in this case is post-baptismal, and it's basically the formation of the phronema, the mindset, and that's what we mean by catechism, or is there more to it?
Well, I just mean that the parish priest is the leader of the local community, right?
Sure.
And so he may have, let's say he has someone working with the youth, right? He may have someone doing, some educational programs for the children. Not necessarily, I'm talking about here church school, but maybe church school, but I'm not sure. Well, just educational programs in general. But if you look at it from a function of time, right? I think at the end of the day, we would want to say, who are our children spending the most time with? And it would seem to me that would be the parents, right? So if you just look at it from the perspective of time, then the primary responsibility would fall to the parents. That you're eating meals together in the evening, preparing meals and eating them and cleaning up afterwards. On the weekends, in other words, the home is actually a center of formation. It's not a hotel.
Sure.
That life is actually occurring there.
Right. So let's just try to describe the ideal school, if we could, from our perspective. Let me throw it out there, and you can tell me if you think this is right and where it's wrong and where it's good. From the Orthodox perspective, it seems to me that there can't be an Orthodox school without an Orthodox school, meaning like consciously this is a school probably connected to a parish and under a diocese. So, and you're in that parish or close to that parish or in a parish very close, and you're sending your kids to an Orthodox school. It says we're an Orthodox school. This is what we do here. We educate in the context and in part orthodoxy along with it in whatever way, that's the discussion. How do we do that? But it can't be an Orthodox school without an Orthodox priest present, blessing, leading in prayer, teaching catechism if they're going to put that in the actual curriculum of the school, and leading in divine liturgy, having the children actually participate in divine liturgy and commune from the priest as a part of the community, not as a separate church, but as a chapel, let's say, connected to the church, and the kids come and they participate in the worship of the church along with the Orthodox divine liturgy. That's essential. You can't talk about an Orthodox school if you don't have the presence of the representative of God, the priest, and he's teaching the people. And then the overarching kind of vision of what are we doing here is not strictly academic, but it also includes the formation of the vision, formation of the children's vision of life through the prism of Christ, the saints, the church, the meaning of life. And so they're looking at all the various topics that they'll be looking at in the created world through the revelation of God and through the teaching of the saints. And so there has to be kind of an organic unity without it being, just one big catechetical process, because obviously there's practical and important things they need to be taught to function in this world. But the spirit and the outlook is driven by the Orthodox worldview. And like you said, the parent would see this as an extension of their work. They wouldn't abandon it to the school. They would be vigilant as a part of the whole process, but they would essentially contract out the priest, the teacher, to participate in what is their key role. And that's, practically speaking, I think most parents, a lot of them have to work two jobs. They're gonna need something like that. It might not be the most ideal. The Orthodox perspective is that the mother should be home with the parents, and maybe they should even be at home educated. I don't know if that's the Orthodox vision or not, but I want to try to put some flesh on the bigger questions, because that's where a lot of people are right now. They're trying to figure out these questions.
And I think it's difficult in our culture today to talk about the Orthodox, right? There isn't really, if we're talking about models and structures, there isn't really the Orthodox way, right? I mean, if you're in the ancient world, you've got those who are getting formal educations, let's say of study or doing tutorials. We're talking about classical education itself, the culture itself, the way that people live. It's passed on from generation to generation, just in the way of life that's around them, right? Their minds and hearts are formed and shaped through the storytelling, through the interactions with the multi-generational family living within a village or a community, generation after generation. And so, when we're talking about it like a St. Cosmas or certain parts under the Bolsheviks and the communists, et cetera, you've got underground schools, you've got secret schools, you've got, you have a lot of, you're dealing with the time and place that you live. And, there's kind of that center core of what it represents.
The core. We're looking for the core. Yeah, we're looking for the core.
So,
what is?
But within the context of what would the ideal American Orthodox school look like? Well, I mean, I think it's going to take shape based on where it's, in a certain way, culturally and economically and located. There's certain places that I think are much more amiable to Orthodoxy in America. Locations and places than other places. Certainly living in urban is quite different from living in rural. And then, you're kind of working from the standpoint of the assumption of, it sounds like a 5-day-a-week school where both parents are working.
Not necessarily, but yeah, that's yours. Your school is 3 days a week with homeschooling, basically. Is that how you would describe it?
Yeah. So our school, the lower school, when they're in K through 5, or Monday, Wednesday, or Tuesday, Thursday at school, and at home on Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, or
so it's a mix. That's a great model. I like that model personally, but it's rare. I don't see that happening very often. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, but I think most are still operating on Father Josiah Trenham has something close to yours, I think, but out of necessity because of the state.
Yeah, I mean, I think he and the St. Constantine School, John Mark Reynolds, I think they both try to offer, like 1 day a week, 2 or 3 day a week, and 5 day a week. In order, and I think that it's a good idea to try to accommodate the different needs,
sure,
right? Because if you have a single mom, it's a very different, let's say social family dynamic at home than if you've got a single income that can support a whole family, sure, and et cetera, et cetera. So I think the way is a little bit hard to nail down, but I think when is the question,
what's the common denominator? Not the practical.
Well, I think to your point, I mean, I think the practical starts with, yes, I mean, the kids should be able to participate in the liturgical life of the church in the school, right? They should be appropriately fasting within the school. In other words, their life at home and their life at school should be a kind of a seamless experience of orthodoxy.
Right. They're being in school. They're getting the same messages embedded that they're getting from the parents. There's not a break, which they would have in a public school for the most part.
Yeah, I mean, that would be the hope. I think that, though, that what the experience within the school goes much deeper than just, let's say, the curriculum picked, or sure. For example, like I would say, you give me a book and I'll teach it. Right now, we could say, give me a good book, and that might be better. But we can take a book that we strongly disagree with as Orthodox, and it can be taught extremely well and be extremely effective. So right. I think it's the pedagogy and the teacher that are much more important in an Orthodox school than it is the curriculum. I'm not dismissing the importance of curriculum, but I think in America we can say, well, if we have the right curriculum, then everything's going to go well. And I'd say, well, no, if you have a properly formed teacher and the proper pedagogy, then things will go well, even with a bad curriculum, although you'd much rather have a good curriculum.
Sure.
And so, so I think just like we've talked about the importance of parents, we're now talking about the heart of a school are the teachers, because they're the ones who are actually with the children, informing their hearts and minds. And so then it comes back to what is the phronema of not just the school, right, abstractly, but actually the teachers themselves. Do they understand classical pedagogies? And here, this don't read that as code for modern neoclassical education per se, as it's kind of portrayed in the larger space, but take it as traditional classical pedagogy that's designed to form the mind and heart that Christians have practiced for centuries.
Where do they get formed in that? Where do our teachers get formed in that? That's a great question. I mean, it's one that I think about a lot. Ultimately, I think the truth of it is that
in education as teachers, you're formed through mentors, and by working with those who've been formed. So, I mean, one of the things I feel extremely grateful and blessed is the teachers that I did get to study under, and they weren't merely great, intellectuals, but they were raised with saints, and understood.
Did that make them automatically great pedagogues? Is that how you say that?
No,
Is that they learn from the saint how to be a pedagogue, or is it more that the ethos was communicated and therefore they can impart that more authentically?
I think it's the unity. I mean, I think when we think about the three hierarchs, for example, right? I mean, they were trained as the greatest rhetoricians in the empire, right? That wasn't a neglected part of their formation, let's say, of the mind. But that deeper within that hierarchy of the formation of the heart, that could put the proper boundaries and direction and purpose on the mind to restrain the mind towards those things which are good, and to focus on those things which are good, is the experience, I think, that really makes the true pedagogue or educator, right? And that's where the imparting of grace, because you have the grace of like the golden tongue, St. John Chrysostom, to articulate beautifully truth. You have a mind that can think clearly and see the problems of the world around you and then critique them, like a St. Justin Popovich. And so I do think, when we're talking about the consummate educator, I think we get those images in a St. Gregory Palamas, right? The three hierarchs, the St. John of Damascus, the St. Justin Popovich, etc. And it, where I think, there are certainly a number of saints that don't have that kind of formal training, and it doesn't limit, in a certain way, their imparting of grace. But as a teacher, right, we celebrate those teachers of the faith in particular way. They do have that even today. I think it was St. George Zacharias III, right? He went to Constantinople. I think he's commemorated today, and had formal training for 12 years in Constantinople, right? And then he combines that with his ability to translate text, and is celebrated as one of the greatest literary figures of Georgia. And so he brings together that ascetical life of Athos with that formal training in Constantinople, and then he gives many gifts to the church, if you will.
So you just you came upon what I was going to ask next, which was, there is a different paradigm. Maybe this is a caricature, I don't know, but it's the popular idea, at least what I've seen, is there's a paradigm and an ideal in the West of what it means to be a teacher, educated, and is it the same in the East? Is Orthodoxy just a better version of it, or do we have a fundamental different vision of because you described, for instance, St. Basil goes to Athens and they become great rhetoricians, and yet his formation really happened in Palestine.
Right. And when, at least according to St. Gregory, when they're in Athens, he says he and St. Basil only knew two roads, one to church and one to the school, the institutions of learning, and the one to the church was much greater worn.
Yes. No, right. I don't mean that he forgot about Christ when he was in Athens, but when he encountered the Palestinian ascetics, he said, "What did I do with my time in Athens? These are the true men's of wisdom. This is the true wisdom, the ascetic life, etc., etc." He didn't say that it was bad, but this is superior. So he made a hierarchy of things. What I'm saying is, we're in a Western world. We're Westerners, whatever. These are terms that are need to be unpacked, but we have a vision here all around us of what it means to be an educated man. Maybe today they've jettisoned even that. They used to be coming down to us in the West. Can we stand uncritically before that classical education as it's understood in these circles around us? Many Orthodox are taking advantage of these classical education platforms that are not necessarily Orthodox. Can we stand uncritically and say, that's it? Yeah, that's Orthodox. Or do we need to actually say, wait a minute, let's make some distinctions here. The Orthodox vision is different. And if it is, where is it different? Is that too much to get into, or could we talk about that?
I think we can talk about that. I think that you're dealing with different anthropologies, right? different understandings of what it means to be a human. And so when you have different visions of what it means to be a human, you have different visions of what it means to flourish as a human. And so I think when we see that reduction in the West to, the deonia, the rational mind, and the knowledge that comes from there, and we've separated the heart and the mind, or the nous and the mind, or however we want to these terms are difficult.
Or we don't even recognize the nous, so we don't even know what it is.
Well, yeah, I mean, once it's separated, it disappears.
Right.
In the anthropological structures, and so I wonder, and I couldn't go into detail about what you're referring to with St. Basil. I do wonder if there's a bit of humility in what he's saying, and a bit of truth. And the reason I say that is you think about with St. Gregory Palamas and the Barlaam controversy, certainly there were these tremendous saints on Mount Athos, right? But you needed a St. Gregory Palamas to be able to protect and defend them in their living, right? And so I just say that from the standpoint of,
I don't think we need to have a dichotomy or to say it's only one or the other. That's certainly not necessary.
Well, I agree.
There's a hierarchy. There's a hierarchy.
Yeah, there's absolutely a hierarchy. And of course, if you're going to choose one or the other, which I don't like that kind of dichotomy. But you've got to shape the harmony. I think St. Justin Popovich says it well, right? We live by faith, but he says we have to think by faith. What could he possibly mean by this? I mean, certainly let's say the process by which I think and you think and everyone think is sort of, let's say, materially the same. But how we think, what we think about, is radically different. I mean, 20th century, produced arguably some of the most, I use this word in let's say the Western sense, intellectually phenomenal people, but also it resulted in some of the arguably the most disastrous and destructive events in human history. There was no chastening of the mind by the heart, right? There was nothing that put boundaries on it, that restricted it, that required obedience, to cut off the mind and the thoughts that go there. And so I think within that context, we have a understanding of the human, which then shapes how we understand what it means to flourish. And that flourishing happens within this hierarchy you're referring to, right? That we meet God in our inner heart. This is where God dwells within us. And as St. John Chrysostom talks about it on the Lazarus and the Rich Man, when we die, this is what will be laid bare. And if the richness of virtue is found there, then we'll know our shepherd, and we will enter the kingdom of heaven. It's not, clearly going to be a multiple choice test at the pearly gates, so to speak. So
it's going to be revealed and apparent to the Lord without us saying a word. Yeah. I want to read you I've got the quote of St. Basil in my book on page 115. I'm going to read it, and then I think it'd be maybe interesting to discuss. So this is his epistle 223, and he's later in life, and he's reflecting, and he says, "Much time had I spent in vanity, and had wasted nearly all of my youth in the vain labor which I underwent in acquiring the wisdom made foolish by God. Then once upon a time, like a man roused from deep sleep, I turned my eyes to the marvelous light of the truth of the gospel, and I perceived the uselessness of the wisdom of the princes of this world that come to naught." Quoting St. Paul. "I wept many tears over my miserable life, and I prayed that guidance might be vouchsafed me to admit me to the doctrines of true religion. First of all, was I minded to make some mending of my ways, long perverted as they were by my intimacy with wicked men. Then I read the gospel, and I saw there that a great means of reaching perfection was the selling of one's goods and the sharing them with the poor, the giving up of all care for this life, and the refusal to allow the soul to be turned by any sympathy to things of earth. And I prayed that I might find someone of the brethren who had chosen this way of life, that with him I might cross life short and troubled straight. And many did I find in Alexandria, and many in the rest of Egypt, and others in Palestine, and in in Syria and in Mesopotamia. I admired their continence in living and their endurance in toil. I was amazed at their persistency in prayer and their triumphing over sleep, subdued by no natural necessity, ever keeping their soul's purpose high and free in hunger and thirst and cold and nakedness. They never yielded to the body. They were never willing to waste attention on it. Always, as though living in the flesh that was not theirs, they showed in very deed what it is to sojourn for a while in this life, and what to have one's citizenship and home in heaven. All this moved my admiration. I called these men's lives blessed, in that they did indeed show that they bear about in their body the dying of Jesus. And I pray that I, too, as far as I may lay, might imitate them. Okay, so that he's reflecting upon and juxtaposing his time, in his youth with vain wisdom. Now, I don't read him as just, saying it was all worthless entirely, but he's certainly saying, here I found true wisdom. Here I found the true way of life in the ascetics. What do you think about that?
Yeah, and I think from that standpoint, St. Basil's pointing out the hierarchy. I think at the same time, we're reading the quote of St. Basil, who had the eloquence and ability to communicate that to us. And so I think, and we also have him as one of the three great hierarchs of the church, who are among the most celebrated, so much so that there was, divisions among which of the three was the greatest. And so sure. I think so I think within that context, we can see that he's pointing to the hierarchy. But I also don't think that at the end of the day, the church has negated his study. I mean, I believe there's a story with Saint Sophrony where he's given obedience to go learn Greek, and he realizes this is going to pull him from the hesychastic life, and there's an exchange there where basically he recognizes that this obedience and the fruits that this will bear in the future will be important, and so he let's say takes the hit, so to speak, or the loss in that near term in order to gain the greater for himself and his neighbor and his
it's a tool, right? They see it as a tool as opposed to an object of acquiring wisdom. I mean, they wisdom is Christ, whereas the acquisition of the Greek language, the Latin language, or the knowledge of philosophical terms, these all seemed more like tools to me. That's how they approached it. I think. I mean,
St. Gregory has the phrase. St. Gregory has the phrase where he wants to submit the words to the word, like the logi to the logos. Right. And so I think when you're reading St. Gregory or St. John Chrysostom, their worry is that rhetoric itself is elevated, let's say, to acquiring this deep wisdom. And what they're trying to say is that, like everything in this life, it has to be crucified, right? It has to be submitted. It has to be, offered back as a gift to the living God, to be sanctified. And so, inasmuch as rhetoric can be used to explicate and encourage and move people to faith, and to deepen people's faith, just like what we read by St. Basil, then it's a good thing, right?
Sure. But it's not
end in itself by any stretch of the imagination.
No. So the school is in part tasked to give us those tools to the children, in order that they might use them properly, and we also train them how to use those properly, put them in the right context. That's let's say the school
with the word tool, I think, just because it feels very utilitarian. It could be read that way, as it's purely, but there isn't a good in itself, right? Like a beautiful sermon isn't just a tool or a channel, right? In itself, there is a goodness in beautiful words, or there is goodness in itself in,
if it's not an end in itself, it means that it's a means to something else. And that's usually what a tool does for us. Like we build a house, the house is the end. The tool is just what we use to get to the house.
Yeah, I'd like to think, though, that when we see, for example, St. John Chrysostom with the icon with St. Paul whispering in his ear, and from his scripts is flowing this river, right? It's not just a river, a tool. It's actually grace flowing in those words. Right?
Sure.
Yeah,
but the yeah, the language is something
In a
that.
hammer, you just beat something and you toss it to the side. I mean, there's something, that even in a
Okay,
hammer.
well, it's a wonderfully intricate tool.
In itself, it conveys grace.
All right. All right. So let's I think we ought to open it up for questions. If unless you want to add one last thought to this very beginning, really, of a discussion about the Orthodox principles of education. Maybe we missed a major principle or a major aspect of the principles before we go to questions. We do have about 10 questions, and I'm sure there'll be more coming. And I don't want to keep you, miss the presidential debates coming up. I'm sure you're dying to. Maybe that we'll find some rhetorical brilliance there. We don't want to miss that. So,
I think the only thing I would add to our conversation, I mean, it's a huge conversation. On any one of these ideas, we could spend, and we as Orthodox Christians ought to spend more time on these questions as a whole. But to also just point out, because we focus a lot kind of on, let's say children, I think between 5 and 18 or 20, 21, 22, that range, that, it does, I think it's clear in the church fathers that the formation of the child from conception through those early years is an absolutely critical stage of spiritual formation for the child, that's tied to the ascetical and spiritual life of the parents beginning at conception through the womb and through those early years. And so we're typically not, although there are ISDs now who are wanting to start early education programs at 6 weeks old in America, including my area that I live in. But generally speaking, we're not really stressing about these questions until kids turn 4 or 5 or 6 years old in general. But at that point, I just want to emphasize that there's the foundational work has been laid in those very, very early years of the love and attention and prayer and care for those children, that not to overlook that part of the child's, let's say, education is formation. So absolutely. Well, and if you read St. Porphyrios, and we're in the process of assisting with the translation of the homilies of Metropolitan Neophytos of Morpho, who has a homily dedicated to St. Porphyrios' vision of how to raise a child. I mean, a lot of it's dedicated to the 9 month of pregnancy, the first 3 years of life. And he pretty much says by the 5th year, it's done. I mean, not entirely, but a lot of what the formation of this human being has already happened. And it's really quite amazing to read St. Porphyrios on this topic. It's very, very unique. And St. Paisius, I mean, there's several that give a good help on that topic, but I just didn't want it to be overlooked where we kind of fall into the modern age of reason notion that, they really aren't starting to be formed until they can, let's say, rationally think or something. But in fact, a lot of that work is done early, and it's important to be attentive to it. Yes, absolutely. I think we could talk a long time also about the formation of the nous and what that means. Like, what is the nous? How is it formed? And these are things that we are just beginning to talk about. So hopefully this little short discussion will be the beginning of many such discussions among a growing Orthodox educational community and homeschoolers and educators, and we can help one another go down the road here deeper. So let's go to the first question, and it's from Orthodox Family Life. I'm not sure if is that used to be a journal called by that name. Is that who this is? I don't know. Many parents don't feel qualified to homeschool. What encouragement would you give them? Well, I mean, when we're talking about homeschooling, right? I would say, this is usually where I start with this question, but if you're worried about how will I do in relationship to, say, let's say public school, I don't think it's too little to say the bar is very low. So I mean that as a positive encouragement, because I've found that a lot of parents are like, well, I don't know if I can do a good job. And of course my question is, compared to what? So if you're looking to offer, if you're having rich conversations at your dinner table and they're thoughtful, engaging conversations at the age appropriateness of the child, they're getting a very good lesson in how to speak well, how to communicate well. If you're telling them stories and reading them stories, at night before they go to bed. If you're doing all these things, the truth is you're going to impart to them a good education. And then, of course, as they get older through those years, it may be the case that, you need certain outside support. Again, a lot of this depends on where you live, what are your circumstances, and just what are your goals within your family kind of culture of hope and expectation of the nature of work that you're doing. I mean, and I don't mean that in like, are you doing hard work or low work or whatever, but let's say, your family's in a trade, then, that trade can be passed through the father to the son or whatever it may be very, very easily. And the type of the education can actually be transposed in a traditional kind of way. So I would encourage Orthodox Christians, and I've seen it over the years, that, you're capable of a lot more than you think you are, to begin with. And I think there's a perceived bar out there of, what that is actually happening. And I would say that a lot of when I taught in public schools, what I found was a lot of the formation of the children that were in public schools was still primarily the kids that were really thriving were actually, it was because it was already happening in the home. Yeah. The parents were working with their kids at night on their math. The kids were working at home at night with their science. The parents were working at night and on the weekends with their children and they were reading and they were talking, et cetera, right? Which means the parents were educating their children. Right. And it's not to say that there aren't any good teachers in public school. I'm not saying that at all, but I am saying, that the bar within the structure is not what people are. Well, and I think through time, we've also been able to see the reality of, will homeschool children be able to, let's say if they want to go to college, be able to be successful? And I think the answer is clearly yes, right? Of course, the key, I think, in homeschooling is you've got to be willing to make the sacrifice, and the sacrifice of it's a labor of love, and it's a sacrifice. It's a blessed sacrifice that has to be engaged and worked, and it ideally could be done within a broader community space of shared ways. I think there's more interesting co-ops, I think, increasingly in America. And those co-ops can be very simple, with a shared day around a liturgy, or they can be more complex and integrated. But that being said, I think that we have to keep the core of our responsibility, which was to envision what it looks like to be able to pass our faith to our children in a sincere, meaningful way, such that they will continue to carry the baton of faith forward to the next generation. And that is the sacred task we're faced with as parents.
Would you say that that almost any parent can do the basic education needed through 3rd, 4th, 5th grade, 6th grade, and does not have to be, have a master's or even a special education to be able to do that for their kids, and maybe things change after that? That's a general perception people have. Is that accurate?
I mean, again, I do think, and this is kind of hard because I don't think Americans think this way. But if you start Greek, like let's say you wanted to become, like let's say you're in a British school, right? And you're starting like intensive studies of Greek and Latin, starting in 1st grade, you do it 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, all the way up through, right? I mean, the reality is that student will have a distinct academic advantage using languages than a student who starts in 7th or 8th grade. So I do think the goals, every family has a certain temperament, let's say, and aims and goals. And I'm not trying to put that in a hierarchy, because the hierarchy is those who acquire grace. But we have this kind of definition of equality in our country that means everyone's the same. And I just, that doesn't seem to play out in the scripture, and it doesn't seem to play out in the history of the church. And so, if let's say you have, so Father, is this making sense? I'm asking you, is this making sense what I'm trying to communicate? That to say that everyone can homeschool through 5th grade, I mean, it is a generic, statement.
I think I'm talking about the very practical demands. The practical demands. Yeah.
Yeah, the answer is yes, but not, but if you had certain type, if you were aspiring towards a certain type of intellectual
Sure.
education, then that's a different kind of question.
I,
But
I,
I think
I guess I'm responding to your saying the bar is low. And so what does that mean? The bar is low. The bar is low for general
schools are doing
society.
very, 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 very little. Right. So, if your goal is, I want to ensure that my child gets a better education than the public schools give. Yeah. I mean, but that's not saying, I think as an Orthodox,
That's not saying much. Yeah.
Yeah. I'd
That's
like to shoot higher than that.
Yeah. Gotcha. With the goal of an Orthodox education to be forming virtue in our children, how do you balance that focus with the need for practical knowledge in order to get a job? i.e., how much focus on catechesis versus math, science, etc.
So I would not want to see a separation between catechesis and, for example, the study of math, right? If you look at the purpose of math historically, in the context of which it was practiced, it is for human formation, right? The purpose of studying math is to cultivate concentration, critical thinking, abstract thinking, memory, et cetera, which are all faculties given to us by God, and are necessary not just to get a job, but, as I like to say, that, if you're a mom, you wake up every day to a new reality of challenges, and you need to be able to exercise all those capacities as a human to flourish as a human. And so, the problem is when we teach math, for example, we do crazy things like 26 times 37. And you say you get a 2 and you carry a 4, which makes absolutely no sense whatsoever, because you didn't get a 2 and you don't carry a 4. You actually got 42, and you put a 2 in the ones place, and you're holding a 40 in your head that you're going to carry over to add to the next. So the way that we teach math in America, not unshockingly, is mechanistic and algorithmically, and it's a process of just blindly memorizing things, which teaches a deep lesson of compliance. But it doesn't produce any real sense of understanding or meaning or significance. I think if you're practicing,
that's why I hated math when I was a kid. That's why I hated it.
It's why most people hate math. But if you actually, if I ask the question, what is 4 to the 0? Typically among adults, I'll get 1, 0, or 4. And the people who say 1, which is, quote, the correct answer, are excited. But then when you say why, nobody has any clue at all, except that's what I was told. Well, that's not a good formative experience, except for do as you're told and don't ask anything meaningful, right? So the discipline of math actually was in the realms of the appearances or the physical changing world in the noetic world. It was placed in the hierarchy of knowledge above, because you could abstractly conceive of perfect circles, etc. Science too, though. If science, I think, is practiced well as a discipline, it does afford the child to cultivate the capacity to ask good questions. Right? You're not actually doing experiments that have preconceived outcomes that you're trying to search for. You're actually doing real science. And so what I'd like to think is that if we could get our pedagogy straight and work towards proper pedagogies with math and science, then it's not an either or for the child and their formation, but it's actually part of that catechism of shaping the child so that, at the end of the day, do you want someone in whatever your job is, like for-profit job, whatever you do you want someone who can think extremely well, think critically, be disciplined, have perseverance, concentration, attentiveness, etc. My experience in talking to even quote unquote major corporations, they're desperate for these people. And those people that cultivate those children, that cultivate those capacities, have no problems becoming engineers or scientists, except for the fact that they now have a disciplined mind, so that they know in a moral judgment that allows them to make proper decisions, which seem to be deeply lacking in our spaces as a whole,
and not desired by certain corporations.
That's right? Absolutely true. That's right. So you would also have discernment on going into what kind of place you would actually work.
So the what you're saying, though, is not going to be functionally present for a lot of people, because what you just described as the proper way to teach math and science, I don't think is happening in a lot of places.
No.
Correct?
Yeah, which again, to your point, this is a much bigger conversation, right? There could be a whole conversation on how do we approach the study of math.
Yeah.
And
so
when you start
we have a crisis. we have a crisis in our own community to find teachers and parents who understand how to teach these matters, so we can learn. The rest of us who've been taught by the American system and never learned how to think properly.
Which is the way, quite frankly, you destroy the past, right? In other words, you end up with a population that's, not that doesn't remember anything from the past, and so the rebuilding or is a very arduous process. There's a amount of rubble that's around us, and we've got to start pushing boulders and organizing them into something meaningful for our children.
I mean, thanks, Father, for inviting Dr. Tarpley. Some of the exchange in the chat raised an important issue. Is public school worse or preferable than a heterodox school? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, when we say a heterodox school, I'm gonna take that to mean a Catholic or Protestant school, and I think any school has a temperament and has a culture within it, and so I think I've known priests that are wonderful, very strong, good priests who, let's say, and I asked them, where did you go to school, K through 12? And they said, well, I went to a Catholic school. And also, how did that go? And they said, well, they were very, very respectful of me being Orthodox, right? They didn't put pressures on me, in direct ways. They respected my ability to disagree in theology courses, et cetera, et cetera. Other schools may not be that way. So I think when you're choosing a school in general, whether it's let's say a non-Orthodox Christian school or a public school, you've got to measure the temperament of what's happening there. I mean, there are, public schools, and even when we first came back from grad school, our children were in a public school, and the principal, she was a very strong person and very respectful of the families. And at that time and place, it worked for us. I mean, in particular, my wife had to work very hard to be on top of everything that was going on and happening. But the temperament of the school was such that we knew that the teachers were going to respect us and our children, and the principal was going to ensure that was going to happen. And so I just think you have to, everything becomes concrete and is no longer abstract when you're in a place and in a time, and you've got to look at those places and say, okay, let me ask myself, is this a place where I believe my child is going to be protected?
So I obviously, some of these things have to be applied and case by case, as you're saying, but maybe what we need to try to help them with is just give them a few criteria or principles how to make that decision. In other words,
the first one I would say is, if you go into a school, always visit a school in mid-April, right? And walk the hallways and see what's going on. And if the school is active and in good order and alive and living, and it hasn't been toppled by the year, then that there's good order there. So I think that, to me, that's always been a good rule of thumb is, if you walk down the hallways and the kids are out of control, or they're watching videos, or the teacher's got their head down at their desk, that is a school that is not thriving, right? So there's a concrete principle. As I always say, schools don't educate children, teachers do. So you really need to know who the teachers actually are. How do they, it's the same thing with university. People say, well, my kid's going in Texas A&M. Okay, well, great. Who's teaching them? I mean, it's the second, one of the largest schools in the country. People teach children, not institutions. And so you can gain a certain amount of trust from the institution based on its culture or claims, but you need to actually know who that person is in that room spending all that time with your child. And what do they believe? And, what are they imparting to your children? So I think that's a second principle that I would put in place. And then the third is you can always look at the fruits, go figure out what the graduates are doing and what they're like. Try to find a space to talk to the graduates of the school, because that'll tell you, in part, exactly what that school is trying to shape and form. So I think
it's interesting. It's interesting. Some spiritual fathers, I have one in mind in Australia who talks a lot about this. He's very adamant. He speaks in his lectures and he says, do not send your children to non-Orthodox schools, heterodox schools. So he has the opinion that there's obviously a stated goal in that environment to form the children according to the image of and the idea of Christ that they have, and that at especially a young age, that's going to deform from the Orthodox perspective. It's going to make a deformation and almost an idol of Christ that's not really Christ. They're not going to encounter Christ properly because of their heretical teachings, and so you're going to have to undo that in a way or later on. Of course, that's a generalization, and you said there are exceptions, and we can talk about it. But I think that's the general thrust of maybe the question, but certainly of this teacher that I have in mind is that when you don't have that, now that doesn't mean that the secular or public school is not doing the same thing. They've got a different vision, and they're pushing it as well, but not as marked, and not with regard to Christ. They might essentially be agnostic or indifferent to Christ, whereas here you have a Christ that's being presented that is not the vision of Christ in the church, and so it's much they're touching their hands on the sacred things, and then you have a pedagogical problem. Whereas if they never address in fact, you might even have a more vibrant child reacting against the spirit of the world and having to live in that and be tested and be, I'm thinking about high school mainly. Than if you had, I don't know. These are generalizations. You could say the same thing.
I think the challenge is it's a generalization, right? I mean, in other words, what is the temperament of the child? Does a child mold easily to the environments around them? What are the options in front of you if you require both parents to be working and there's a public school where there's massive amounts of drugs and violence and kids are getting beat up in the bathrooms every day, or you've got this school where there are kids that have some level of decency and some level of concern and kindness. I mean, so yeah, it's hard to get into that generalization, but I think to your point, there are things you can look for, and then you have to know your children and what they can handle and how big is the community. I mean, if you're in a small, rural community where everybody already, and there's only 2 Orthodox families there, your kids are mixing with those kids already every day, versus an urban.
So there's no substitute for discernment, basically.
Yeah,
there's no substitute.
Idle Evil says that Mrs. Discernment, right? It's the we joke in our home. It's the D word, right? It's the hard question.
Yeah. You can only do so much, and then you got to actually go and consult your spiritual father on a case by case basis.
Yeah, it always becomes concrete very quickly. Yeah.
Hello, Mark. This is Sophrony. Perapant Leontiov is the name that's on the screen, but I don't know who Sophrony is. In what way can an Orthodox education help create the space to allow young people to form families? Atomization in society is creating a loneliness epidemic. So how can Orthodox education create the space to allow young people to form families?
Yeah. I think it's an excellent question. And it's one that I think we're facing as an Orthodox, community in America as a whole. And I see a lot of different ways people are straining to try to resolve these questions. And I don't want to say that, I think it's just like when we're talking about schools and homeschooling, right? We're there's no blueprint for facing what we're facing right now. If you're talking about the ancient church fathers, they even if they lived in a pagan culture, that pagan culture had some notion of sacred realities. It had philosophical systems that it wasn't the nihilism that we are faced with today, I would argue. And so I think we're in a space where it's going to take, and I don't mean this generically, a lot of prayer, a lot of discernment. I've always been encouraged by St. Pius' quote where he says, what the saints of old wouldn't have given to live today because of the manifold struggle that we face. And, because it's easy to get down and talk about the nihilistic culture and all these things that surround us. But St. Pius just kind of turns that on its head and says, but look at the manifold opportunity of struggle that the Desert Fathers would have given anything to try to take on today. And I think that turns it into a very positive direction. But I think within that context, there isn't an easy solution. There's no simple formula, right? I mean, we can talk about things like where, I think there are good things that are happening. They're not happening at much of a scale in our country right now, but there are good things happening for some youth to be able to form and meet, to be able to grow together. I think the challenge, and I think Father Weaver talked about this just the other day, is trying to artificially construct something is very American. To artificially construct communities is very difficult, and it's an American thing to do. And so I think the answer is, I don't have a good answer to that question, except for the fact that I think we as Orthodox Christians have to apply ourselves to the problem within the liturgical, ascetical, and sacramental life of the church. And we have to have conversations and be able to ask the questions like you just asked, and not turn our eyes away from them. And so maybe the first thing is just to acknowledge the epidemic of isolation and loneliness that can be tied directly to becoming Orthodox, because you've just entered into a paradigm that's the inversion of the world in which you live. And that's a very difficult thing to do.
You might I add, I think you have to dial it back from the goal and the ideal of a marriage and say, what goes into making a wonderful family and a marriage, and then consciously have that in mind as you're raising your children and in the school setting, if it's an Orthodox school setting. So, one of the major things that's under attack, which is so essential, is the role of the mother, the wife, the modesty that is so essential to virtue, goes along with humility. And all these things need to be modeled, they need to be the examples of that. And so you have to consciously cultivate that in the children and say, these are the examples we have of what it means to be a woman. This is an example of what it means to be a man. If you can't be a woman or a man, you can't be a couple, ultimately. Like, the roles aren't going to work. And so there's a ton of work that can be done, but it's going to be mostly, I would think, in the household, and then secondarily in the educational setting. But it should be reinforced, right?
Yeah, I would say, Father Peter, I agree with you. I think the challenge is, certainly we have the lives of the saints as examples, but we don't have that many good examples with the context we're living today, right? In other words, how to manifest that life as what does it mean to be a good mother? What does it mean to be a good father?
That's true. That's true across the board in every way, including like monastics. Like, we have, right, or whatever it is. We're gonna have a shortage of virtue generally, but right. So it's a challenge.
I don't mean that as a negative, just as an acknowledgement of the challenge in
yes.
front of us. But that's why I referenced St. Pius. We shouldn't fear the challenge, because God is with us, and He's not going to abandon us in that challenge.
Absolutely. Okay, we got a lot of questions, and we're going to have to go a little bit quicker through them if we're going to get done before the presidential debate, right? So that's the important thing. How can you even start to talk about homeschooling when you have to go to work? In some families, to survive financially, both parents need to work. This is a reality. All right. So this is a great question. A lot of people are in this position. They might want to homeschool, but they just don't see how it's done practically. What do you say to them?
So I'd say we've talked about that. I think we've tried to talk about that this evening, which is that homeschooling means participating in the lives of your children. Education is formation. So if you are in a situation, which many people are, where both parents need to work in order to financially make things work, then you make sure you have dinner if your job schedule permits, or whenever that time is you have available. You make sure you value that time well, right? You don't decompress into screens. You don't outsource that time to activities, but you ensure that you homeschool, right? You school your children at home. You give that education space where you're reading stories at night together. You're having discussions at the table. You're going for walks. You're doing good work in the home, whether it's working in a garden, or working in a with some tool sheds, or fixing something at the house. But you're talking to your children. You're nurturing that relationship with them. You're praying with them in the morning before school. You're praying with them at the end of the day, at night before you go to bed. You're doing your best to participate in the services within your strength. I mean, I get all that. It's got to be measured against your strength. But I think homeschooling, I think of in certain ways as just an extension. It's kind of a fuller extension of that time formation space. And if you are in a situation where the kids are at school 5 days a week and you're both working jobs, then you're jealous and protective of your time that you have when you are together, and you don't outsource that into consumptive activities. You don't outsource that to other places, but you protect it.
Yeah, and I would say absolutely just start doing whatever you can with the time you have, and then pray fervently that God might open the door for you to do more. And you might have a miracle that you don't expect in terms of the practical aspects of the question. So,
which I would just add a footnote on that. The Orthodox way is to start doing things, and then things are revealed.
Yes.
Opposed to thinking about things. So it's just start doing good things.
Yes. Yep. When the school is small, the government may not care much, but if it gets to doing well, they may intervene in America in secular ways. It's part of the problems the RCC had. Okay, so I don't see a question here, more like a comment.
Yeah.
All right. Where are the best places to be in America, Orthodox in America? That's kind of a general question. Maybe we should change the question and say, where are the best places to be in terms of Orthodox education in America, if you have any thoughts on that? Or you can answer that question.
I would just say where you are.
Plant where you are.
Yeah, plant. I mean, that's my perspective, is plant where you are, and live there, and begin to build the roots. I mean, there are circumstances, I think, maybe where, it's with guidance from your spiritual father, that it may be necessary to move. But I think the American impulse is to move somewhere to solve your problem, and to educate your children. And again, I can understand the rationale behind that thought. And maybe if you've only lived in a place for 6 months or a year, but I'll just say that, moving to another location takes decades to actually root yourself in that place and within that local community space. And when I say local community, I'm not just talking about the Orthodox that are there, but the people that are there, because we have to have gratitude to the people in the community that are not Orthodox, because they are part of what makes your life possible, just as the land gives life to us, that we have to have gratitude. And so I think my initial thought is to resist the temptation until you have absolute clarity that you need to move somewhere, but instead begin working where you are. And as Father Peter said just a minute ago, see.
As long as you have an Orthodox parish, I would say that would be a what's the word? Not sine qua non. You have to have an Orthodox parish that you're at least attending. It might be far. A lot of people have to do that. They have to travel an hour or something, but that would be essential. And then go from there. I was asking earlier, who is Orthodox Family Life? And it's Christina T in California. So there we go. We have Christina T. I also want to tell you that we did a poll, Mark, to see our listeners, what they're doing in terms of education with their children. And we found out that 32% is 117 votes. It's a pretty good amount. 117 votes. We got about 280 people following us most of the evening tonight. 32% of the 117 say they do public education with their children. 21% does private schools, including Orthodox schools, we're not sure quite how many are Orthodox, 44%, almost half, are homeschooling. And then I said, do you homeschool and teach as parents? And that 44% said yes. 3% said online classes for my children almost exclusively. So that gives you a little sense. It seems like most people, 65% or 68%, are doing either private schools or homeschooling.
Yep.
All right. Next question is, why are these schools not extant? Are bishops responsible for our lack of schools? What's your thoughts? You know more about schools, what's being done. Are they being, it seems to be a grassroots movement almost entirely of either parishes or laymen. Would that be accurate?
I mean, I can honestly say I've never spoken to a bishop who opposes a focus and emphasis on Orthodox schools. So, I certainly would not say that our bishops are opposed or indifferent. I think, but to Father Peter's point, I think it's primarily coming from the grassroots side of it, and in part, my perception, I don't know, but it seems like a lot of dioceses, it's enough for them a lot of times to just keep the priest, going and the local parishes going, and so the side of education seems to be kind of a financial challenge and an energy and time resource challenge that's just very difficult. I don't mean that as an excuse. I'm just simply saying, is it their fault? No, I think it's a Orthodox community as a whole, right? All the levels of the church, and can certainly begin to engage. And I think there are things happening that are good in the Orthodox education spaces, and we need to keep putting effort in those directions as a whole. And I think, part of it is the maturation of Orthodoxy in America, and things don't move very quickly on those fronts.
Takes time. Yeah. And it's not an easy thing to start a school. I mean, it's very difficult.
Well, yeah. So the next question is, Orthodox private schools widely acceptable? The answer is no. And in part, that's because it's incredibly difficult, whether you're Orthodox or not, to start a school. But it's particularly difficult to start an Orthodox school because, if you're going to have a healthy functioning school, you're probably going to want to have 400 to 500 students that make it financially viable. And, at that point, you really gather 400 to 500 Orthodox children in a local community space. And the answer is very few places could actually pull that off. And so then you're going to inevitably have a large mix of Orthodox and non-Orthodox kids in the school. And you're going to have a very large mix of Orthodox and non-Orthodox teachers in the school, and maybe a mix of non-Orthodox and Orthodox administrators in the school. And then, is that good? Is that not? That's a whole nother conversation that we haven't even touched on tonight. But it's just to say that, I think it was in a talk at St. Cosmas, someone had said that you can get 80% of a school in a highly functional, organized co-op without exchanging dollars. And so it does seem to me in general that if Orthodox parishes are looking to start schools, that having a charter, having a board, having an highly organized co-op seems like a more viable option for Orthodox than trying to transition into actually dollar exchange. And then who can afford it, right? And then, or if they can't afford it, who can endow it, right? So those are the challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. For our parish has a majority of homeschooling families, but most people are driving 45 minutes to an hour to attend. It seems we could generate some kind of co-op, even if monthly during a feast. Do you have any thoughts on seeing something like this? All right. So practical considerations make it difficult for them to be together. But so what's a good solution? Is it something like coming together for major feast, etc.?
Yeah, and presumably you're there together on Sundays as well, at a minimum. I mean, maybe other service, but 45 minutes is a long way to drive. So I don't know how many times people are traversing back and forth, and what are traffic patterns, if there are any, etc. But yeah, I mean, I think the amount of cooperation, which is the definition of like a co-op, that you can create, when and how. It could be the case that, for example, like among all the second graders, you plan to read these, what's the little book series, Father Peter, the little Lives of Saints. There's
from Athens, that publisher from Athens.
Yeah. I'm just saying, for example, like you all agree to read those books to your elementary kids, and then come together once a month or on feast days and discuss them, right? So you can have very impactful but minimal cooperation among the homeschooling families, but you can do things that extend across the time when you're not together either, that you agree on. So the kids are having a common formation, a common experience, and when they're together, they have let's say a canon of experience that's important. And I do think that is important for children. We talk about the great books or canons of texts that should be read, but I think the first canon obviously is the New Testament, and then by extension is the life within the church that our kids ought to be able to be familiar and have an easy conversation with each other about. So I think there is definitely cooperation that can happen even with those kind of distances. It just means that actual physical time together is much more limited.
We got about 3-4 minutes. I want to just go quickly through this. First of all, thank you, Big Joe. Thank you very much for your donation and your support. We appreciate it. And Mark Patterson says, aren't there Orthodox religious orders that start schools, in particular nuns? I've never heard of that. I know there is a sister who's going to be speaking at the Antiochian Western Diocesan Conference next week from Jerusalem, who is, I think, the head of a school there. But otherwise, we don't have religious orders in Orthodoxy like the West does. They don't have those kind of, activist kind of roles in monasteries. So I think.
And I mean, you have like Marius, who was a monastic hierarch who was the head of a school, but
Is POD schooling a good alternative? What is POD schooling? I don't even know what that is. Do you know what that is? POD schooling, pod schooling.
I'm afraid I'm probably not 100% sure what.
I'd have to Google it. Let me Google it and see if anything comes up. I've never heard of pod schooling. Since learning pods, everything learning pods. They come together to learn and socialize. Learning pods are organized by parents. Maybe it's just like another word to say like a co-ops or something. It sounds like. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, me reading that initially looks like a certain structure of co-op, but I mean, so in that sense, I mean, unless there's some deeper philosophical underpinning, students getting together in groups to learn, but there may be, I'm not sure if there's more underneath that. I'm not familiar.
Well, before we close out, I want to just make 1 or 2 announcements and then thank our guests tonight. First of all, everybody who's not aware but may be interested, we have a new publication from Mountain Mountain Press, Formation in the Love of Truth, Principles of an Orthodox Education by My Unworthiness. And we have faith. We're looking at chapter 1 is Have Faith, Examining Homeschooling and Compulsory State Education. Have Faith, examining it in the terms of its history, but also today, how we're gonna do it. Seeking Truth, forming children in the love of truth, patristic and post-patristic view of education and salvation, and then a central place of the Orthodox Academy. We're kind of covering that in many, many questions. You also have some books that you've written. Would you like to share 1 or 2 titles people can find on Amazon or wherever they're published?
Yeah, so I mean, they're at ForgottenLighthouse.com. Beginning to Read the Church Fathers. That's a set of, I think, texts that I've used to teach high school students, college students, even occasionally middle school students, that are accessible. I think good excerpts of patristic text, and then there's questions at the beginning, and then there's commentary at the end of each of those readings. Actually wrote a commentary on the Martyrdom of St. Polycarp. I think that's a phenomenal text for students to read, and it allows them, as Father Peter was talking about at the beginning, to see, history from an Orthodox patristic perspective, to see it as the early Christians saw history, rather than how we have kind of modern historiographic structures of thinking about time and space. And then, another one was actually on Woodrow Wilson's speech. So I wrote a commentary on Woodrow Wilson's speech, and that was another one. And then I did one that was a desire to say, okay, what are the presuppositions or that are important to understand in educating a child in Orthodoxy? What are the presuppositions that are working in the background? And so that was a fourth one that I worked through. So anyway, that's it. Yeah.
Is this your website?
It is.
Okay. So we've got Forgotten Lighthouse.com, and you've got, looks like some articles.
Those are seminars that I've offered.
Yeah. And then you've got your books. Got your books down here. Yeah.
Yeah.
Fantastic. So check out Forgotten Lighthouse. And there's also up here, you've got curriculum and seminars. You offer seminars in what capacity?
We've done those in small groups, like of 6 to 10 people. Mm-hmm.
Also, fantastic. So ForgottenLighthouse.com. I wanted to also say before we close that on Tuesday, July 2nd, we're going to be live early in the day. I think it's, if I remember correctly, 1:00. We'll be announcing it. We're going to have Adam Lockridge and Father Turbo from Kansas City. And they have started a school there in the parish, and they're going to be on, and we're going to continue the discussion that we started today with Mark Tarpley and look at what they're doing in that parish setting in their school. Adam Lockridge used to be the headmaster over at St. Raphael homeschool, online homeschool, and now he's the headmaster at this brick and mortar school. And so, God willing, in the near future, we'll have more such podcasts looking at Orthodox education, Orthodox homeschooling principles, et cetera, et cetera. But it was our honor to have you, Mark, today to start it off, and hopefully this will encourage more discussion. And thank you for joining us today. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Father Peter, and God willing, we'll continue to all labor in this space for the salvation of our children and the world.
Amen. Amen. And hopefully, when I come by the monastery, we'll take a spin up the road to Dallas and see you next time around.
That would be wonderful.
All right. I appreciate your time, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you for everybody joining us tonight, and have a good evening. We'll see you soon. God bless.